Boa tarde a todos. Tudo bem?
Hello.
Hello, Michael. Tudo bem?
Hello.
Prazer conhecê-lo. Vou fazer.
Likewise. Yeah.
Vou fazer a apresentação formal primeiro, depois eu te apresento por uma outra via.
Okay.
Vamos lá. Hoje mais um encontro do Tiaços. A gente até o final do ano teremos mais 2 encontros. E hoje a gente vai ter a grande alegria de receber Michael Whan. Vou apresentar o Michael. Ele é analista junguiano sênior do Grupo Independente de Psicólogos Analíticos, da Associação Internacional de Psicologia Analítica, do Colégio de Psicanalistas do Reino Unido e membro da Sociedade Internacional de Psicologia como disciplina da interioridade. Michael também é associado sênior da Sociedade Royal de Medicina e patrono do Departamento de Estudos Germânicos do Instituto de Línguas Modernas da Universidade de Londres. Ele publicou em várias revistas de psicologia, publicou capítulos em vários livros, e o mais recente é Nihilismo e Verdade, permanecendo com o negativo, no livro Vergonha, Temporalidade e Mudança Social. Michael, prazer te receber. Queria te contar uma história sobre o seu convite.
Thank you very much for asking. Thank you for inviting me.
A gente, há cerca de um mês atrás, nós tivemos o Wolfgang Giegerich aqui conosco para o lançamento do livro A Vida Lógica da Alma, em português. Para nós foi uma imensa alegria e surpresa ele ter aceito o convite. Confesso que eu insisti bastante, fui bem insistente e consegui convencê-lo. Antes desse convite, eu havia mandado um e-mail para ele perguntando se ele me indicava alguém para falar sobre a psicologia como disciplina da interioridade. E foi ele que me sugeriu o seu nome. Eu já conhecia você, dos seus textos, mas o fato dele, o próprio Giegerich, ter indicado o seu nome, para nós foi uma imensa alegria e prazer. Então, eu fiz o convite para você, você muito gentilmente aceitou. E, por favor, sinta-se à vontade para estar com a gente. É uma grande alegria te receber. Fique à vontade. Um grande abraço.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I feel very privileged to be talking to you, and especially on Wolfgang Giegerich's work. So tonight I'm really going to talk about his book, Working with Dreams, Initiation into the Soul Speaking About Itself. Now, this was published this year by Routledge. So it's I think, yes, it's his newest book. It's a very complex book. It's a very rich book, an abundant book. And it's very difficult to give a talk on it and really touch on, I mean, one can only touch on a few things in it. It's a book that obviously he has written out of many, many years of experience of working with dreams. And also of giving seminars on dreams, both in Japan and in Europe. So I'll just have a little epithet, a little quotation from the American philosopher Emerson. Which is, our life is an apprenticeship to the truth. that around every circle another can be drawn. Right, anyway, so referring to Freud's influential book, The Interpretation of Dreams, I've often heard individuals say that dreams are the via regia, the royal road to the unconscious. Nevertheless, what Freud in fact wrote was that interpreting dreams is the via regia, the royal road to knowledge of the unconscious life of the mind. That's from a translation in 2006, an English translation of The Interpretation of Dreams. Key to Freud's statement is the work of interpretation. Working with Dreams, Giegerich's book, takes up this question not only of interpretation, but many other necessary elements in such work. To pick at random just a few themes in this timely crafted work, Giegerich writes of dream as already an interpretation, the ontology of the dream's internal world, the significance of dreams in therapy, the soul speaking of itself, the proper attitude to dreams, who in the dream interprets the dream as subject and self, the dream I and the other, the dream and the patient, the ulterior purpose of an assignment for dream interpretation, beyond working with dreams. These are just a few of the elements or features of this abundant thinking in Giegerich's seminal, deeply thought-provoking work. Central in this work on dreams is the process of dialectic. Such a dialectic brings up the question of who or what interprets the dream. The therapist, the dreamer, both, or the dream itself. Giegerich, as with his other prolific writings, takes up and pushes off from Jung's psychology. His dialectical approach returns to and thinks through further Jung's unique insights. At the core of working with dreams is Jung's notion of a psychology with soul. Psyche, the ancient Greek word for soul. Jung writes in the English translation, we can perhaps summon up the courage to consider the possibility of a psychology with psyche, that is, a theory of the psyche ultimately based on the postulate of an autonomous spiritual principle. That's the English translation. In the German text, however, Jung speaks not of psyche, but Seele, soul, and not of an autonomous spiritual principle, but more fundamentally than this meaning given in the English translation, of an autonomous mind, Geist, spirit, mind. Giegerich then takes psychology at its word, namely as the autonomous logos of the soul. Elsewhere, Jung defines psychology thus, quote, psychology, however, is neither biology nor physiology, nor any other science than just this knowledge of the psyche. Psychology grounds itself in the bottomlessness, the inner infinity of the soul's logos. As the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus said, you would not find out the boundaries of the soul even by traveling along every path. So deep a measure does it have. The crucial thing in Heraclitus' statement is that it is the soul's logos that is deep. The Greek word logos is here translated in the English as measure. The soul too may be deep, but that is not the main point Heraclitus makes. Jung understood psychology in its peculiarity as dialectical. Its logic was euroboric, self-reflexive, circular, hence my little quote from Emerson. This dialectical logic lies embedded, for instance, in the alchemical dictum concerning the philosopher's stone. Hence, to describe this euroboric logic in terms of the alchemical notion of the stone that is not a stone. So at first there's a positivistic, factual type statement referring to an actual empirical thing, a stone. Something is being said as factually real. Next, this cancels itself out, is negated. That is, it is said to be not a stone. After this first negation, then, follows a second absolute negation, which states it is neither a stone nor not a stone. This is also what is meant by alchemy as an opus contra naturam, a work against nature. Not meaning, however, a work against nature, the real physical nature, but against naturalistic consciousness. The positivistic binary logic of being and non-being is sublated, overcome by the second absolute negation, which absolves itself of the positivistic being-non-being duality. The statement positing an actual stone annuls itself, but then preserves itself. And with the negation of the negation, raises itself to a higher, more complex notional level. This whole dialectical movement takes place from within the logical movement of the notion itself. The alchemical nostrum, the stone that is not a stone, does this thinking from within and to itself. It is not something applied externally by an outside agent. It is rather a dialectical movement inherent within the very statement. From this thinking, which lay embedded in the alchemical imagination, the alchemists distilled the notion of the spirit in the stone, but a spirit reducible to neither a literal nor an imaginal stone, mercurius non vulgi. It was a statement that could only be comprehended in thought, as paradox, or better yet, dialectical thought. However, it was only much later with his alchemical psychology that this dialectical approach becomes more explicit in Jung's thinking and writing. Nonetheless, even with his basic psychological standpoint, Jung manages to bring out this dialectical logic, without calling it that, as the basis of his psychological thought. The psyche, soul, is both psychology's own true subject and object. Jung writes, quote, "No explanation of the psychic can be anything other than the living process of the psyche itself. Psychology is doomed to cancel itself out as a science, and therein precisely it reaches its scientific goal. Every other science has, so to speak, an outside. Not so psychology, whose object is the inside subject of all science." Unquote. Absolute interiority. In the English passage, the verb to cancel itself out translates the original German word aufheben. This translation fails to depict, the English translation that is, the reflexivity and subtlety of aufheben. In English philosophical literature, this expression usually translates as sublation. It is a dialectical notion found in Hegel's works, meaning to cancel out, but then to preserve and raise to a higher, more complex level. Another way in which Jung expresses this is that, quote, "We should never forget that in any psychological discussion, we are not saying anything about the psyche, but that the psyche is always speaking about itself." In the psychology with soul, soul is always speaking about itself. Herein constitutes Giegerich's methodological principle for working with dreams. It refers to what Giegerich calls the psychological difference. After Heidegger's notion of the ontological difference, the difference between beings and being. It marks the difference in psychology between our human or to human inner life, our personalistic psychology, and the difference with the psychology of the soul. Giegerich puts it this way: "Dreams are precious," this is quoting Giegerich, "dreams are precious to the psychologist because we see them as the soul speaking about itself. They do not express the dreamer's subjective psyches, the eye's views," unquote. Therefore arises the question, who or what is speaking through the dream? Quote, "Is it the objective psyche, the soul, or is it the person, the ego personality?" Unquote. Many approaches to dream work presume that the dream is speaking of the dreamer's inner life. The dream depicts something meaningful about the dreamer. The psychological difference begs us to listen to the dream for the sake of the dream not the dreamer. The dream is not about our personal transformations, complexes, problems, feelings, etc. Rather, the dream concerns the logic of consciousness, the logic of our being in the world. Nevertheless, as psychotherapists, we obviously need to relate to the patient in the room. In the practical reality of psychotherapy, we must not absolutize the soul over and against the patient's psyche. Not every individual needs this soul depth approach. A psychology with soul needs the psychotherapist to have one leg in work with the soul and one leg in practical reality, the sphere of the human all too human. Quoting Giegerich again, a true unadulterated access to soul, as well as a realistic insight into human nature and understanding the needs of the patient as human being. Thus, being a psychologist, in the strict sense of the logos of the soul, one must also not be totally identical with being a psychologist. That is, absolutizing this identity. One is both a psychologist and not a psychologist in psychotherapy. This requires the subtle feeling, tact, thoughtfulness, intuition, and practice wisdom to know when to be one and when to be the other. And of course, that can happen within the same session. Not an easy differentiation. Only when we manage to make these differentiations, difficult as they are, separating out soul from the human, do psychotherapist and patient face each other in their common human nature without taking on the inflated mantle of soul. Soul, Giegerich defines in two ways. Quote, all metaphysical ideas of soul as they traditionally prevail in theology in metaphysics and popular religious thinking, including myth, must be excluded. Soul cannot be conceived as an entity. Soul has emptied itself of these former modes of expression. Today, psychology alone offers soul its authentic self-reflection and self-expression. Psychology, as the soul's true logos, has returned to itself. Giegerich's concept of soul, underpinning the methodology of working with dreams, means, quote, thinking in terms of soul is not thinking in terms of people, unquote. The soul needs to be kept conceptually, quote, free of any attachment to or subsumption under positive factually existing people, unquote. Soul should not be reified, hypostaticized, substantialized. It is a way of thinking, imagining, feeling, even being. It's a perspective. It's not a thing, not an entity, just a way of looking and thinking. It exists just in the mind and is something logical, something noetic, just thought. Dream logic is dialectical. It is not my movement and meaning that expresses itself in a dream. Rather, the soul's self-movement, the objective psyche's self-development, is self-unfolding for its own purpose. It is sufficient unto itself. All that it needs from us is to realize and recognize it as a truth, unquote. Soul is real and realized, though not in a positivistic, literal, or empirical sense. What is needed is the development of psychological consciousness. The dream addresses psychology itself through the medium of the patient and therapist. It is psychology itself that is the real, true, intended addressee of the dream, the soul speaking about itself. Soul, in the sense of it now taking on the form of psychology, refers to the notion of absolute negative interiorization. Dreams are but one expression of this. Their interiority, the interiority of a dream, is not that of the empirical inner and outer of ourselves as in actual individuals. The dream's logic is not one of positivity. Neither is the dream unconscious. The dream is consciousness. This is implied by Jung, referencing the Talmudic saying, quote, "The dream is its own interpretation," unquote. So Jung could say, "I take the dream for what it is," unquote. Giegerich distinguishes the Euboric logic, its self-reflexivity at work in and with dreams. The dream is already an interpretation. Hence, when interpreting a dream, we are interpreting an interpretation. To the question who or what interprets the dream, the answer is the dream itself. Therefore, the soul interprets the dream, interprets itself. Jung quotes the alchemist Richard White, who was writing to Johannes Turris in February 1567, stating, quote, "Thus, if the soul would know herself, she must contemplate herself," unquote. In these few words comprises the whole insight of psychology, in Jung's sense, into itself. And Jung added to that quote, "The psyche gazed at herself," unquote. Precisely what is soul doing in its current form as psychology? Our job is to maintain the dream's absolute interiority, its hermetic integrity, further to which Jung gives this fundamental methodological insight. Jung says, above all, interpreting the dream or the fantasy image, above all, don't let anything from the outside that does not belong get into it. For the fantasy image has everything it needs, unquote. For Giegerich, working with dreams requires being able to stay in not knowing. Indeed, we need to treat the dream as an unknown object. We do not need to get caught up in our egoic, narcissistic rage to interpret, nor to compress the dream into our theoretical stance and jargon. Stick with the image. We may be much more with the dream in our not knowing than willfully needing it to surrender up meaning. With the latter, we may end up unknowingly with fool's arium valgi. Wittgenstein accused psychoanalysis of fetishizing meaning. Our job is to circumambulate the dream, circling it slowly, patiently, asking questions, observing detail, imagery, its internal logic, its feeling atmosphere, and internal relations, connections, and hiatus You know, there's moments of sort of where things seem suddenly to switch in a dream to a completely different scene. These are the things we have to pay attention to, focusing on all of those details, asking questions, trying to get a feel of the dream without trying to get any meaning out of it. We start from a place of external reflection, wherein the dream appears as an object. We have this dream written before us or somebody telling us it's an object. Then slowly, attentively, devotedly, we enter the dream through a dialogical engagement. The relation to the dream transforms from speaking about the dream to speaking with the dream. The dream is referring to itself, transforming from an object to a subject, to a self. It's like speaking with someone else. Whatever associations, amplifications, understandings come to us, they must come as the dream's gift. Writes Giegerich, quote, "The otherness of this, my knowledge, that I adduce to the dream must have been decomposed, worked off, because I made the 0 point of knowledge my methodology. Not knowing is where we have to start. Knowledge returns as the dream's gift. It reappears as the dream's own and integral association, as inspired and evoked by the logic of the dream, as its living and liquid core," unquote. We need to remember the soul, this absolute interiority of the dream, what Jung was saying about not letting anything get in that doesn't belong, its depth and inner infinity, is a methodological claim. It's not saying anything about the ontology of the dream in that sense. It's more about this is how we approach the dream, how we try and think about it. It's not a real subject, but in the instance of the dream, the soul exists only in its moment of self-expression and self-interpretation. The dream itself is the soul presenting itself, displaying itself. There's nothing in this way of looking behind the dream. There's not some invisible agent or author reified and operating independently behind the dream. By way of circumambulation and interiorization, patient and psychotherapists need to inscribe themselves into the dream. It means positively our dedication to the dream, dwelling with it, interiorizing ourselves into it. The work here comprises a dialectic, for we can only bring ourselves into the dream if it is apperceived as its own interpretation. We have to start from the place that the dream is already an interpretation. And conversely, the dream can only be its own interpretation through our having abandoned ourselves to it. It speaks and interprets itself only in and through us. An analogy is the work of a poem. The poem stands on its own, is indeed self-sufficient, its own interpretation. The poet or reader needs to dedicate themselves to the poem, interiorize themselves into it. In a way, the poem creates both poet and reader, yet still dialectically, the poem can speak and signify only in and through us. Always there is this alchemical Euroboric relation, the serpent swallowing its tail. Or think of a musician. A piece of music only comes alive when it's being played. So it can only manifest through us. And yet it is also, of course, its own self, as it were, its own subject. Taking the dream as unknown means that we do not regard the familiar figures, scenes, situations of our personal life as what the dream as soul intends. These figures are not internalized object relations, parents, childhood, personal relations, friends, famous people, painful occurrences, losses, anxieties, other kinds of events and experiences. Such dream figures and experiences are a symbolic imagery used by the soul for its own unknown ends. Some dreams may, of course, have such personalistic meaning in their makeup. Even then, the psychotherapist needs to try and differentiate and interpret the personal elements from the dream's intentionality, its own interiority, the soul's intention. For instance, commonly in anxiety dreams, the threat, be it a violent figure, a wild animal, persecuting triggers, prompts the dream eye to attempt to escape. From the soulful point of view, the anxiety is the way in which the anxiety is the way the dream reaches consciousness. It's precisely that feeling of anxiety or terror that the dream gets through to us. It impacts on the dream eye and thus the patient's daytime eye. The anxiety belongs to the dream's intentionality, the soul's purpose, which reaches the patient's eye via the so-called negative feeling. However, we should not assume that our daytime eye's negative reaction to the dream comprehends the dream's meaning. What I call a negative feeling may be more my negative reaction to that feeling. The feeling not being itself negative from the soul's perspective, or if it actually is objectively negative, may be necessarily so. Writing on anxiety, Kierkegaard observed, quote, "Anxiety is a desire for what one fears. Anxiety is an alien power that seizes the individual, and yet one cannot tear oneself free of it, and one does not want to, for one fears, but what one fears is what one desires," unquote. That's from Kierkegaard's book, The Concept of Anxiety. Giegerich focuses on the way in certain anxiety dreams, for example, a conflict and separation exists between the dream eye and the internal other, the persecuting dream figures, such as the enemies, murderers, shadow figures, animals. The conflict is not about two dream figures, but two interests, views, tendencies, or stances embodied by the dream persons. The interest of the experiencing eye, the dream eye, and that of what Jung called the non-ego, which Giegerich calls the soul. Interpreting them as we often do as actual figures in our actual daytime existence, past and present, object relations, for example, literalizes them. Giegerich analyzes the relation between these different psychic stances. The dream eye wants to escape, to get away, to survive. He defines such a survival mode in the dream as the dream eye seeking to rescue its old form of consciousness, its present orientation and mindset, itself as ego, unquote. Conversely, the threatening figures in the dream want to get in contact with the dream eye, to enter the structure of consciousness, become integrated into it, which would amount to a logical revolution of the present consciousness of the dream eye. Hence, what from a surface level looks like conflict may, from a deeper level, as Kierkegaard indicates, be more a dialectic. Anxiety expresses itself in dreams as dialectical self-othering. The dream eye is a complex figure, a fiction like the other dream figures. Often after a dream in which the dream eye appears, and of course it doesn't appear in every dream, more so in modernity, the dreamer will identify with the dream eye. Giegerich argues that the sense of ego and I is really something that's arisen in modernity, that it wasn't so prevalent or even there at all in more ancient or medieval times. his book from 2020 on the nature of the emerging I. But such identification is questionable. So, you know, when I immediately assume I've had a dream last night and I was being chased, and I identify with that figure who was being chased, that needs to be questioned. For we shouldn't take that identification as a default position. You shouldn't assume it immediately. However, even when the dream I expresses a defensive attitude, the psychotherapist needs to stand back reflectively. The analyst's task is not to be against the dream I's resistance. So if I'm running away, or if I'm a patient, and then as a psychotherapist, I shouldn't be criticizing the patient for running away, because the dream I's resistance or flight, the patient's resistance, the resistance is part of the dream, part of the whole picture, and is just as it is. We must not wish to bring about any change. If we did, we would intrude our own ego intentions into the objective reality of the dream. So we'd be doing what Jung said don't do, which is projecting ourselves into the dream and saying, do this or do that, or you shouldn't have done that. Treating the dream as a self means respecting its integrity, even when it grates on or disturbs us. As we would treat another person, not manipulating them to conform to our wishes, attitude, and so on. A kind of unconditional regard, though an intelligent one, seeking not to change the other, but to comprehend it. It isn't our job to solve the problems in the dream. The soul, quote, has to take care of its own problems, unquote. What is needed for us is to attend as honestly and carefully and with as much psychological comprehension and human feeling as we can muster, unquote. Looking at anxiety dreams in this way is to realize their hidden dialectic. The dream I is being chased because it is running away. The latter is the standpoint of the dream I, and often the dreamer's daytime ego. And for the therapist and patient to adopt that standpoint is to reinforce the fight-flight reaction. Entering the dream instead allows a different and a radical perspective, maybe even disturbing, but soulful. The dream in such instances represents an oppositional structure, a soul internal tension, which is both its own offer to itself, which the soul either accepts or refuses. There are other kinds of oppositional structure in dreams, which Giegerich goes into. Opposition as obvious conflict between two, and the dialectic of what he calls successful flight, or the opposition as a dream I doing the other's bidding. Opposition as antithetical meaning of one and the same. Somebody today brought a dream in which they're a therapist and they had invited one of their relatives to their civil partnership wedding in December. And this girl turns up with her whole family. And in the dream, the person I'm working with, she in the dream, or the dream figure of herself, was really shocked by this and really didn't want the whole family there. But they were insisting that they were going to be there. So she acquiesces, she goes along with it in the dream. So this was an instance of an opposition in which the dream I actually does exactly what the other in the dream, in this instance, this girl's family, was insisting, even though the dream I didn't want it. Or there is an opposition as impugning the known truth. So you know something to be true, but you deny it, you disavow it. Giegerich offers us a rich, multifaceted work on dreams, too much to gather here into a single talk. I want to focus, though, on one element, the dialectic between the givenness, the remembered dream, and for Giegerich, the the only thing we actually have is the remembered dream. We assume that, you know, our remembered dream is something that went on in the night. But in a way, all we actually have is what we have remembered. And then the interpretation of the dream. There is a saying that an uninterpreted dream is like an unopened letter. Unpacking this way of working, Giegerich offers a meta-reflection about the deeper function and purpose of dedicated work with dreams. He develops his thinking from a statement by Jung. So this is Jung saying, we have simply got to listen to what the psyche spontaneously says to us. What the dream, which is not manufactured by us, says is just so. Say it again as best you can. And then there's a quote, an alchemical quote. What nature leaves incomplete, art perfects. The first task then is to listen to the dream, to reading the text or listening to the patient telling you the dream, to be silent. Giegerich says that psychotherapy is not so much the talking cure, it's the listening cure. The dream says what is just so. Jung, there's a quote from Jung somewhere where Jung says, the dream walks in like an animal, just walks in like seeing an animal in the forest. That's the way the dream presents itself to us. That means sticking with the dream text, sticking with the dream images, not even translating them into the jargon of psychological theory. And then we have to say it again. We have to find our own words for the dream in the context of, but always remaining true to what the dream actually is saying as far as we grasp it. And yet, even when we say it again, of course, for content-wise, we're not supposed to put our own bit into the dream. All we're trying to do is trying to say it again. We're trying to remain faithful to the dream content. We must feel bound by the non-ego, the psyche, what it spontaneously says to us. And this is, this is the real task of understanding working with a dream. As Giegerich puts it, this perfecting of the dream's imperfection, the need to say it again. But it's not an abstract, universal, absolutely faultless, supreme, excellent interpretation. It's not about getting something absolutely, perfectly correct. Rather, it is connected to the concrete individual, the actual therapist, each one doing their best. As Jung says, it is relative to the concrete individual, the actual person sitting there interpreting the dream or trying to. Perfection here means to represent the dream in the particular human subject's own words, but in the sameness, that is, with its content, an idea painfully preserved, unaltered. Perfection, therefore, entails the transition to subjectivity, to the reproduction of the received dream through an artful and artificial human intervention. And, Giegerich talks about how maybe the next day you look at a dream, you will see something different there. Because the interpretation is always this dialectic between the dream and the actual person interpreting the dream. Interpreting means returning the dream to itself. The semantic content is preserved, but the dream's form, its syntax, is no longer under the spell of the imaginal form. So it's kind of trying to think what the images mean, rather than it's sticking with the image, but trying to see through the image to what the soul might be saying. Reflecting the dream in this way has its roots in human freedom, in our active subjectivity. To listen to the just so-ness of the dream and saying it again expresses an inherent paradox or dialectical reversal. So this is Giegerich. First, we need to be standing objectively over and against the dream, which is for us a mute text. And then we arrive precisely at that point so at that point, we're not hearing and we don't know. And then again, secondarily, but not immediately, we try methodologically to consciously and deliberately slowly work ourselves into its detail and start saying it again. Only by saying it again can we begin to truly listen to the dream in the first place. And can it begin to have truly its say for the first time? Our truly listening to it becomes possible only after our having said it again. Paradoxically, therefore, it is the art that gives birth to the true nature. Only through the art and the process of interiorizing into and bringing our conceptual comprehension to the dream can we at long last arrive at the dream speaking as what is just so. Hence, this dialectical work of perfection, this alchemical art, encompasses both an objective relation to the dream and our subjectivity, since any interpretation may be more faithful to the dream speaking as just so, or it may turn out not to be so. In other words, it is objective in the sense of implying what the dream as its own interpretation means. Such objectivity is inextricably correlated with our individual concrete subjectivity. And subjectivity is our relative, fragile, fallible individual standpoint. The concrete instance of saying it again. The relation here is dialectical, a reflexive logic, which is absolute in the sense of being absolved of the subject-object dichotomy. It is not subject-object as divided opposites, but subjective-objective, objective-subjective. Additionally, interpretation as subjective reveals as much about me as the interpreter as what it says about the dream. We as psychologists, psychotherapists, need to risk self-exposure, stand out, existence, risk getting things wrong when we work with dreams. The dream as soul speaking about itself cannot be commanded to offer up its gifts of meaning or whatever. It may or may not do so. And anyway, anything we say will inescapably include our subjectivity. Approaching dream work then requires us to reflect on the nature or form of consciousness and its methods by which we apprehend the dream. The psychological framework we work within cannot itself be exempt from critical self-reflection and self-relation. This psychological self-consciousness is what is thought-provoking, is what gives us pause to reflect. Giegerich's book is precisely that, an extended thought-provoking meditation on dreams and what it means to work with themselves, namely the soul speaking about itself.
Obrigado, Michael.
Hello. Okay.
Vamos abrir agora.
It's not an easy book to talk about. It's, you know, it's not an easy book. I mean, hopefully people will be able to read it, but there we go.
Mas a sua fala traz uma série de questões que são importantes para a gente poder pensar e discutir. Pessoal, vamos abrir aqui para as perguntas. Quem quiser fazer pergunta, coloca o nome e eu chamo, tá? Mike, eu queria começar fazendo duas perguntas.
And hopefully I can answer. I don't promise I can answer them. I'll have a go.
Não tem nenhum problema. Nenhum problema.
Yeah.
A primeira pergunta, Michael, eu queria uma pergunta mais pessoal.
Yeah.
Como a descoberta para você da obra do Hillman do Giegerich, e particularmente no que diz respeito ao trabalho com sonhos, modificou a sua prática clínica? Você sentiu efetivamente uma alteração? Como foi?
Certainly in the way I will listen to a person's dream and think about it. But most of my people who come, I mean, the kind of people I'm seeing are either sort of patients who are coming because they have problems. I have one or two people that have had psychotic issues in the past and are sort of on the borderline currently. With one person, for example, I hardly, although he occasionally mentions dreams, there's no way I will go into dreams with him. He's actually frightened of the word the unconscious, because the word unconscious for him is like a psychotic, another mind telling him what to do. It's almost like what the Freudians used to call the influencing machine. So with somebody like that, I try and work in a very different way. There are one or two people who bring a lot of dreams. The way I try and work with that is people, as Giegerich mentions, and as I'm sure we all know, and I do it as well. I mean, both with my own dreams sometimes when I remember them, but also when I'm working with people. There is the assumption that if they have a dream about, and they're in the dream, that they're dreaming about themselves. I try and slow that down. And I say, for example, well, the figure you have of yourself in the dream, let's just say it isn't necessarily yourself as you understand yourself. It may be something coming from a deeper place in you or in your psyche. I always try and say in your psyche rather than in you, which is, in a way, it has your image, but it's not necessarily you. So let's not assume that the figure in the dream is yourself. So it's really trying just to get people basically at this point to kind of step back and just work more slowly with the dream, and even not, and this is quite difficult because you say to people, we find dreams useful. The assumption is we're going to, distill meaning from them rather than stay with the image and just try and work. What does the image feel like sensually? What is essential? Does it have any color? What form does it has? Was it vague? People will tell you, for example, they have a dream and there was somebody there, but they don't know who that person was. They just had a sense of presence. So try and get the person to relate to that sense of presence, not to find out who it was or anything, but just what does that feel like? Just to get them to feel there was a kind of unknown presence close by, very, maybe even intimate with them in the dream in a certain way, accompanying them. They may, what did that presence feel like? Was it friendly? Was it frightening? These kind of things, but not always trying to work very slowly. And Jung's image of circumambulating the dream, which Giegerich, I mean, in the book, there's a lot written about circumambulation, which is really about going around the dream. There's a poem by the American poet Robert Frost, The Secret, no, we dance around a ring and suppose, but the secret sits in the middle and knows. Yeah, so that's like the dream. This whole idea that Jung says the dream is an unknown object. It's like a person you've never met. You don't know anything about them, but you're trying to get to know them. But slowly, they may reveal things about themselves, they may not. But the point is, it's your interaction. And that's why Giegerich talks about working with dreams, not working on dreams, but with them, trying to get some kind of sense of the dream as a self. The idea of the soul, it's not an entity, but when it appears, when it manifests as an image, and for Jung, psyche is image, soul is image, but also to see, to see through the image, maybe to get some meaning, maybe not. I mean, it's kind of, as I said in the talk, the dream may offer something up, but maybe the most important thing is establishing a relation with one's dream life, learning to listen to it, to write it down, to try and be exact, or if you don't, most of my people don't write them down, but to try and get them to be very precise in the way they talk, and to kind of hold back. And something I have to do myself, as well as with the person I'm working with, of not rushing into try and interpret, not to be so hasty in interpreting, and certainly not to leap in terms of this dream is about my wife or my husband or my child, or those are figures in the dream. They may, it may be more that the dream is about egoic concerns of the ego personality, and that's one of the things that one has to try and tease out in a dream. Which, is it really a soul dream? I mean, or is it more, the person's own concerns, and then one tries to work with that up to a point, but always kind of holding a sense that the dream is something more. It's from a deeper place, so yeah, it's changed. I'm much more hesitant to rush in to try and with the person to interpret, to understand, but to try and stay in a more unknowing place with the person, ideally, get them to, so that they go on with that as well, of course, that they go away from the session and maybe they go on thinking about it, go on working, looking at the dream. Hillman used to have an image of putting the dream in the fridge and then taking it out next morning and looking at it again and putting it back. Or he talked about approaching dreams is a bit like Zen, when you're doing a koan in Zen, trying to figure out the koan, then your mind drifts off and it goes there and it goes there and it goes there. And the Zen master goes like that and brings you right back down to the immediate, where you should be in the present. So, I think it was Jung that said, stick with the image, stay with the image. Tell me about the image as much as you, or tell yourself about the image as much as you can. I mean, I don't really ever talk about soul with the people I'm working with. I think they would find it, well, first of all, they probably think I'm talking in a religious way, which I'm not. But I mean, to go into the kind of stuff in here with somebody, there's not many people would, they'd kind of get their coat and they'd walk out, throw their hands up. No thanks, not today,
Tá ótimo, Michael. Obrigado. Michael, vamos começar então as perguntas. Luciana, por favor.
Okay.
Obrigada, Michael, pela sua palestra. Eu tenho uma certa dificuldade, vou confessar, com o Giegerich, de entender, de concordar, enfim, mas a sua palestra, acho eu que eu consegui acompanhar os conceitos. E uma coisa que eu fiquei pensando, como eu não tenho intimidade quase nenhuma com Giegerich, alguma das coisas que você trouxe me lembrou um outro autor que eu tenho muita intimidade, que é o Hillman. Então, teve muitas semelhanças que eu vi em algumas falas suas. Por exemplo, isso, bom, ficar com a imagem, o ver através, né? E principalmente o falar com o sonho e não sobre o sonho. Né? Você acha que a gente podia dizer que existem semelhanças entre os trabalhos dos dois? Ou até uma espécie de desdobramento do Giegerich, do livro dele, né? O Sonho e o Mundo das Trevas?
Well, first of all, remember that Giegerich and Hillman were very close friends.
O Sonho e o Mundo das Trevas.
Yeah. Underworld. This. Yeah. Yeah, this. Yeah, the dream. Yeah. I mean, yes, there are a lot of similarities. I mean, Giegerich is certainly very respectful, like Hillman is, of images. And the idea of the dream, the idea, I mean, what Giegerich, I mean, for Hillman, the image is the soul. For Giegerich, it is the medium in which the soul presents itself, but it's not. Giegerich has this dialectical notion. And, you know, the idea, Giegerich is difficult. First of all, you know, his thinking is very rooted in German philosophical tradition. So unless one is steeped in that, you know, it's a way of thinking that's very different. So, I mean, I've been reading Giegerich for many, many years, and I still struggle. And I will go on struggling, and that's okay. You know, I think because it is such a different way of thinking. If one thought one understood Giegerich, or rather, if one thought one could understand those kind of concepts and that, probably one is not really. It's a bit like I said about the dream. In not knowing the dream, you may be more intimately connected to the dream than somebody who rushes along and says, oh, I know what that dream is. And it's the same with struggling with Giegerich. Anyway, I mean, Giegerich and Hillman were certainly very close. When you read The Soul's Logical Life, it is critical of Hillman's work. I think Giegerich became critical of Hillman's work in terms of not his in the book Giegerich's book on dreams. He says in that book, you know, if you want to, he recommends people going to Hillman's writings on images and dreams, because he rightly says, you know, these are very educational for us as psychologists to go and understand dreams. Go to Hillman. There's this book. There's also, I don't know if you know, they're bringing out Hillman's collected works. And there's a book called Animal Presences. And there's a collection of Hillman's essays on animals in dreams. It's really, very, really very good. It's worth, if you're interested in dreams and Hillman, that's worth having alongside Dream and the Underworld. So there are similarities, but also I think Giegerich is critical of the way archetypal psychology, and it's not necessarily Hillman, it's the way people have picked Hillman's work up and kind of talk about mythology as if we could just step back into the mythological mode of being. I mean, for Giegerich would say we can use myth as we can use Shakespeare, or we can use Borges, or we can use any Dostoevsky as a way of interpreting. But what we can't do is, you know, for Giegerich, the gods are not alive for us anymore, you know. And even Hillman said, you know, we can't step back from 2,000 years of Christianity back to the ancient Greeks and the gods, you know, that's, but what we can do, if we're very interested, Giegerich uses a lot of alchemical thinking, as Hillman does. I mean, Hillman's written a lot of alchemical papers on alchemical psychology. We can use those as a way of interpreting our work without, as it were, assuming that these concepts are what's actually happening within us. Because for Giegerich, we are projected into modernity, whether we like it or not. We live in the modern world. For him, the soul is our culture, our history, and that's where we have to really relate to. Jung talks about, in a very early paper, he said, neurosis is really about the critical present. And I think that is also where Giegerich puts us. Hillman was more, had more of an antagonism to modernity. You know, he was more kind of an activist, you know, political, in a sense of trying to bring psychology as a form of critique on modernity. Giegerich is more about using it to understand modernity. There's all the papers Giegerich has written on technology, very, very important, interesting papers on technology. But he feels that psychology shouldn't be political, in the sense that it needs to be as neutral as it can to observe what's actually happening. But as a private individual, of course, one can be radical, one can be political, and one should. But where Hillman would kind of, you know, use psychology as a kind of critique force, Giegerich would not feel that's right. For him, it's more about really employing psychology to understand what's happening as deeply as possible. But if you get into a kind of critique mode with it, then of course you're going to take sides, and maybe then you won't actually see what's happening. But then you, as a private individual, what Jung called civilian man or civic man, of course, then you have a position. You are political. You take your stand, whatever it might be. And with the image, as I say, Giegerich certainly feels the image is the important medium. But he, I mean, if you read, you know, he will go kind of beyond that a bit, into trying seeing what's below the images, or seeing through the image, that there's something there. And of course, for Giegerich, it's dialectic all the time, that hidden in the image is a sort of dialectical process, and trying to understand that if we can. And it's not, I was trying to look for some, I mean, there are a few dreams in Giegerich's book where he, you know, gives a few examples of his thinking. So you get a sense of it, but the anxiety dreams are quite a good way of looking at, you know, looking at the dream from the dream's perspective. But what we think is disturbing and wrong might be actually what needs to happen. But yeah, I mean, they were very close. They did kind of come apart toward the end of Hillman's life, and Giegerich went off on his own, and they had their intellectual fight, really. But Giegerich does, in his book, you know, the dream book, he recommends Hillman in terms of learning about how to approach an image, how to speak with the image or listen to the image. Yeah. But Giegerich is hard to understand. You know, it's like Heidegger. You know, I've reading Heidegger for 40 years. You know, and God knows. So it's okay. It's okay to struggle. it's good to have a fight sometimes. Fighting with rather than against. You know, men and women, partners fight with each other. They don't fight, well, they do fight against each other. But when they fight with each other, then there's something, there's fruition there somewhere. One day, hopefully.
Bom, obrigada.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I've gone on. Yeah.
Obrigado, Lu.
Yeah.
Vamos lá.
Yeah,
Wagner, está aí, Wagner?
Opa, tô aqui. Tá escuta bem?
Sim, sim.
Ok.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Michael, eu escutei, né, atentamente, né, a sua apresentação e me vieram muitas reflexões, inclusive sobre a minha prática clínica com relação à interpretação dos sonhos. Você usou alguns termos muito interessantes, né? Tipo, manter a integridade hermética do sonho, né? Interioridade, estado de não saber, né? O sonho como objeto desconhecido, né? Isso me remete, né, a uma metafísica. É difícil a gente é difícil a gente escapar de um olhar metafísico, né? E quando a gente pensa na possibilidade de um método interpretativo, de uma hermenêutica, né, a gente encontra alguns obstáculos importantes. Por quê? Porque a alma ela é autônoma na sua expressão. Então, pensar, né, um método, interpretativo para o sonho parece uma contradição. Né? Então, na minha prática clínica, eu aposto muito na minha relação com o paciente e na emergência de um conteúdo intuitivo, como um canal cognitivo. Né? O que você acha disso? Né? A intuição, né? Como um elo importante para poder, como uma hermenêutica, de fato. Porque o que eu percebo? O paciente ele tem uma ânsia que o terapeuta interprete o seu sonho. Né? Existe uma necessidade que o terapeuta interprete, né? Como se ele soubesse, né? E eu percebo que o paciente tem limites, né? Então, como reduzir essa distância, né? Entre aquilo que o terapeuta compreende e aquilo que o paciente é capaz de compreender, vamos dizer assim. Obrigado.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a difficult and it's for me, that kind of issue that you've raised is a sort of ongoing issue all the time, really, with most people, really, that you know, they come, they want something, they're paying money, they're spending time. Some people come for years, you know, so they want something. I mean, my sense of it is it doesn't always work with some people. I mean, it just doesn't work, and maybe you can't work with dreams in that way with them. And a lot of people aren't well, first of all, many people, or some people anyway, don't remember their dreams and they don't bring them. When they do, again, as I think I said before, it's trying to get the person to slow down in terms of, you know, trying to get something from the dream. It's like really saying, you know, trying to get them to see the dream as something that they need to develop a relationship with. And, you know, that can go against the grain of the way, you know, people come with a sense of a dream. You know, they've seen dream books in the bookshop where you go and you look up the dream and you say, what's this? And it tells you that. And that's people's idea of dreams and what dreams mean. So it's really a relearning for people. And it doesn't, you know, for some people, it just doesn't work. So it is trying to go slowly. Well, I think I'm just repeating what I said before. It's really trying to get people to look at the dream and sort of, you know, as if it was an unknown thing they've got in their hand, and turning it over and looking at it from different angles. time and again, and just going very slowly and really trying to feel, using their intuition, but always trying to stay with what's there. I mean, Jung didn't like using free association with his patients, because he said the free association, people just go off into their own complexes. So you have to kind of basically slow down and try and work much more. This is why I find, taking up Luciana's thought of Hillman's work, that, you know, the image is there. They bring an image, or they bring a feeling. You know, sometimes people say, well, I don't remember the dream, but I woke up in a real bad mood, or I woke up depressed. So maybe, you know, I think one of the things that I've come to feel a lot is that when we wake up, sometimes, most of us, I think, wake up in a mood of one kind or another. And if we remember the dream, we may be able to relate the mood to the dream, or may not. But I think sometimes people wake up in a mood, they don't remember the dream, but they're remembering the feeling, the mood, the emotion. So maybe one will then say, well, can you imagine something with that? Can you find an image? And it may not be, you know, it may not work. It may, and it might give some handle on the mood to get a hold of the mood, because there's an image there that they can catch hold of. But I mean, the way I'm working with people who are bringing their dreams is really to kind of slow down and really spend, first of all, I mean, some people will bring you 4 or 5 dreams in this. Stop doing that. Just work with one dream. If they're very short dreams, maybe 2. And just spend, to the extent that one is going to spend a lot of time in the session, and that may not be possible sometimes because people are bringing, you know, their immediate life concerns and they don't want to talk about the dream. But if they do, then to really spend a lot of time with it, as if you were looking at a painting or you know, reading a poem, and just trying to work at that slowly and get and develop a relationship with those things, using all the senses that we have. There's a Hillman's ex-wife, Patricia Berry. She wrote 2 very, very good essays on working with dreams. There's a book called Echo's Subtle Body. Echo's Subtle Body. It's published by Spring Books, and there's 2 really, really good essays of ways of working with dreams, of finding, for example, other words. So a patient tells you, you know, I was going downhill. So you get the patient to say, well, you're going downhill. So what does downhill feel like? Now, in English, going downhill means kind of getting into could mean a depressed state, or it could mean in life, you know, one's luck, one's fortune has really taken a bad turn. So trying to hear the words, trying to hear the image in the words. I'm going downhill, or, you know, I've gone on a long journey, you know, trying to listen to the words and find images in the words. Or, you know, if there's any feeling in the dream, like when they say those words, to try and get a sense of that. But always trying to amplify the image, not by finding other images, but by using our senses, our intuition, our intellect to try and get there. But always, as I say, slowly, this idea of circulating around the dream. You don't actually go and touch the dream, but you kind of look at it from different angles. But it's not easy. I mean, I've got probably about 2 or 3 people in a whole practice of about 26 who I can work with dreams to some extent. The rest don't bring dreams, and well, you can't force it. You know, it's not what people are coming for. So it's not an adequate answer to what you're saying, but it's the best I can do tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning I'll have a better answer. Yeah.
Obrigado, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Obrigado,
Okay.
Wagner. Michael, a Patrícia Berry,
Yeah.
a Patrícia Berry esteve com a gente aqui no teatro também. Foi uma das nossas convidadas.
Yeah.
Né?
Okay, great.
Arthur,
contigo. Good. Yeah.
Boa tarde, gente. Obrigado, Michael. Obrigado, Tiasos. Eu queria pontuar 3 questões, 3 pontos, né, que a palestra evocou para mim. E, bom, a primeira foi sobre as questões pessoais, né, porque foi dito que o sonho não está tendo como fundamento as questões pessoais das pessoas. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente vê milhares de sonhos que trata do pai, da mãe e de várias questões pessoais, né? E a impressão que me deu é que o Giegerich está propondo aí esse método pelo caminho da Aufhebung, porque algo é negado ali, no sentido de que não é a questão pessoal que está sendo colocado como central no sonho, mas algo é preservado. Então, me deu essa impressão de que não é que o Giegerich está propondo que a gente ignore as questões pessoais que possam vir a aparecer nos sonhos, mas que aquilo seja levado ao Aufhebung. Né? O segundo ponto é em relação à questão, foi dita, sobre que a alma que se sonha, né? Me deu a impressão de que o Giegerich está dizendo é impossível haver um sonho que esteja fora do espírito da nossa época, não é possível haver ideias, sonhos, sentimentos que estejam meio que dando um pulo para fora da alma, para fora do espírito, né? E aí nisso eu acho que está sendo incluído aí, inclusive, a maneira com que ele vê o livro vermelho, os livros negros, né? Aquilo não é uma produção fora do espírito, né? Bom, e o terceiro ponto é com relação ao fundamento dos sonhos. Porque parece que o Giegerich está dizendo que o fundamento do sonho não é a emoção ou a imagem, como a gente vê diversas vezes em textos do Jung, como se tivesse emoções e imagens, intuições prontas e que se expressavam em sonhos, né? Parece que o fundamento do sonho é uma coisa, assim, vou falar de uma maneira um pouco hegeliana, né, que parece aquela coisa do círculo, porque parece que a gente vai negando aquilo que vai se apresentando, né? Por exemplo, a gente sonhou com o pai, mas não é o pai que está sendo, não é o fundamento ali, não é a questão com o pai, aí a gente vê outras questões relacionadas, e na medida que a gente vai negando, parece que a gente vai encontrando conceitos. Então, parece que o fundamento é também o resultado de todo um processo. Parece que cria um círculo aí e tira a gente dessa ideia de que o fundamento do sonho esteja em emoções e coisas que a gente não tem nenhum tipo de controle, né? Como se fosse fora da própria alma, né? Como se fosse fora do próprio espírito. Enfim, eram esses 3 pontos.
Certainly, I mean, Giegerich, I think I tried to say, and maybe not adequately, but, you know, Giegerich sees the therapist as having to have his legs in both camps. He can't ignore the fact of what the person is bringing on a personal level. And then there are these other factors. The soul factors may or may not be what is decided on in terms of working. I mean, it may be that you as a therapist are not going to work with those things. You may see them, you may hear them in the work, but that is not the level at which you are, as a therapist, are working with that person. But in the background, you may hear something more. For example, you mentioned about the father. Now, I mean, people may dream and bring a dream of their father. It may be that on a personal level, there are a lot of issues around on a personalistically, but then, you know, one may hear that notion of father in a different way as the concept of the father sort of manifesting in this instance with this particular patient on, you know, through the imagery of the father. But then you would be probably saying that this is and is not my father in a sense. I mean, you have to work with to the extent the person can grasp those kind of things and maybe what is pressing. The other thing you mentioned about dreaming within modernity and not, I mean, he does actually acknowledge, for example, he talks in the book about because he's had a lot of connection with Japan and the way the Japanese dreaming and the way of working and understanding is, despite the fact that the Japanese are obviously highly, you know, within the kind of modern world, that he sees them as having still a very deep connection with another way of being, another mode of consciousness. And he also talks about people who are more mediumistic personalities, who do dream of something that may be more archaic, that doesn't seem to be of the modern world. So these dreams can appear, although he would not see them as relevant to modernity. They may be very relevant to the individual concerned. He talks about the psychological difference, not in this, well, he does talk about it in this book, but in another book, What is Soul, where the psychological difference is sort of all taken over onto the subjective side. So the individual may have many, many archetypal type dreams, and they're important to the individual and they're meaningful to the individual, but they're not relevant anymore to modernity, to the modern world, because they belong to another age. And they're like, I mean, you know, he talks about the museum really, that they're part of our inherent imagery, symbols. Maybe he talks equivocally about archetypes. There's an essay where he's very critical about them, and yet he does use the word, but more in Hillman's sense of archetypal as an adjective rather than wouldn't go along with the idea of archetype as a structure, because that would be a kind of positivism. Sorry, and there were something else you asked about the dialectic beneath.
Sobre a questão do fundamento, né? Do fundamento não ser mais emoções, intuições.
Yeah, I mean, he sees, you know, his notion of the dream, of the dialectic, is that this is something living. you know, that these are what they call, or Hegel called, you know, really existing living concepts. They have a life of their own. There's Jung's idea that the psyche is autonomous, you know, and that's what we have to kind of, if we're working in that way, that's what we have to kind of grasp and develop a way of relating to that autonomy, so that, you know, I may dream of a teacher, not somebody I know, I've never met, I don't know who he was, complete unknown figure. And that may be that is the concept of the teacher coming into the dream. This is the soul as teacher. Or I dream of a policeman, not somebody I know, I am no personal instances involved, but this is about law, this is about order, as a concept coming up, but personified, that the dream personifies concepts. And those are the basis of the dream, not emotion, not image, although the concept will use emotion, use image as a way of expressing itself. But, you know, that the idea would be to try and think through to the concept and understand it, if possible.
Tudo bem, Arthur?
I wish I could give you a better answer.
Tudo bem, muito obrigado.
Yeah.
Foi muito bom.
Michael, uma dúvida que eu acho que seria interessante a gente pensar.
Yeah.
Algumas categorizações clássicas do pensamento... Luciana, continua aqui, eu tenho um probleminha aqui, pode ser? Rapidinho. Já volto. Pode ser, Lu?
Eu não sei. Você não quer terminar a sua pergunta? Sei lá, probleminha técnico lá. Oi, Ieda tá aí ainda? Você não quer completar um pouquinho a pergunta que você tinha feito? Você falou que eu fiz, mas acho que você deve ter alguma coisa para completar.
Tá bom, Lu. Tenho sim, obrigada. Obrigada, Lu. Michael, obrigada pela sua fala, muito interessante. Eu, como a Luciana, também não tenho essa intimidade toda, né, com o pensamento do Giegerich, estou começando a estudar. E, na verdade, eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho mais sobre a questão do ego onírico no sonho, porque naquele livro da Patricia Berry, que você citou, O Corpo Sutil de Eco, ela tem lá no final aquelas regras, ela fala da regra de Layard, que tudo no sonho está correto, menos o ego onírico. Isso se aproxima com a visão do Giegerich ou não? Essa questão. Queria ouvir um pouquinho mais sobre esse ego onírico nessa perspectiva do Giegerich. Obrigada.
Mm-hmm. No, he would disagree with that, in the sense that for him the integrity of the dream needs to be respected, in the sense, for example, that if I see in a dream that the dream ego seems to be resisting something happening, or is obviously highly defended, or is running away, or is fighting, to follow that rule would be to say that the way the dream ego in the dream is behaving is wrong. Now, Giegerich would say it may be obvious that the dream ego is defensive, but it is not the job of the therapist to say that it's wrong, in the sense that the integrity of the dream is that is what is happening in the dream. Whether I as a patient or I as a psychotherapist like it or not, I may say that's very defensive, or but the integrity of the dream means you respect the dream. So if somebody is running away, you respect them running away, because that is the way the dream has manifested itself. So to that extent, Giegerich would disagree with Patricia Berry's notion. That idea came from an very early English Jungian analyst, what's his name? I've forgotten the name now. But anyway,
Layard.
Yeah, John Layard. Yeah, Layard's son, John Layard's son, is an English economist who was the force in England behind CBT. So I don't know if that says anything about what you thought about his father. Talk about rebellion, you know. Anyway, but yeah, John Layard, very interesting bloke. He tried to commit suicide, and he blew part of his brain out. And people said that with half his brain missing, he was still more intelligent than anybody else. Yeah. He was. He had a relationship with Auden, the poet, the English poet, W.H. Auden. They were partners for a while, anyway. Yeah. But anyway, he was, interesting bloke. Somebody has to write a biography of him one day. But yeah, Giegerich would disagree with that. The dream has to be respected as it is, even if, you know, one's reaction to it is, no, what you're doing is not. Because again, you see, one is assuming that the dream ego is the same as the person dreaming, you know, the dreamer. And that is not, one has to reflect on that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Obrigada, Ieda. Marco, consegue continuar?
É que o meu filho caçula, Michael, passou aqui com um copo de suco de uva derramado na camisa. Parecia uma imagem de um pesadelo. Eu tive que rapidamente correr para ajudar. Mas coisas da alma, coisas da alma. Queria voltar à minha pergunta. Algumas divisões clássicas do trabalho junguiano com sonhos, do tipo interpretação a nível subjetivo, interpretação a nível objetivo, grandes e pequenos sonhos, sonhos pessoais e sonhos arquetípicos. Toda essa categorização, você acha que ela se sustenta ainda a partir dessa perspectiva que o Giegerich nos apresenta? Ou elas se tornam um tanto quanto estéreis, terapeuticamente e teoricamente?
Certainly the idea of the objective and subjective interpretation of the dream, Giegerich does not go along with that at all, disagrees with it. He sees it as a kind of subject-object split. Also that it to do that is to put the dream in the person rather than the person in the dream, in the sense that, you know, then you're talking about the dreamer's subjectivity and the object relations that dreamer has. So from this perspective, one would not work in that way. Archetypal, as I said a few minutes ago, Giegerich seems ambivalent about the word. I mean, he doesn't, like Hillman, does not go along with the idea of archetypes as structures in, you know, wherever they are. If he uses the word archetype, it's more archetypal in the way Hillman would talk about use it adjectively, that as a way of the certain images or certain dreams have a depth that other dreams don't seem to have. You know, there's a kind of nuance to the dream. There's a sort of depth that goes, you know, you have a feeling this is something more. There's an image there of something. So he would probably see that. But as I said before, it would probably be of value to the individual but it would be more about trying to see the dream in the context of, you know, what's happening in the modern world, really. If the dream can show that. I mean, the dream examples he gives in that in the book, I mean, he gives a few. In a way, you could, they are personal in a sense. I mean, you can see how, as a therapist, you would be talking to the patient and it would be relevant to the patient. For example, there's a dream in there of a dead baby, and then the dreamer comes into the room, sees the dead baby and starts looking at it, and the baby comes alive. So Giegerich says, well, and this is, I think, very similar to how Hillman would work. The reason the baby comes alive, whatever the baby is because attention is being given to it. So when in the dream, the dreamer gives attention to the dead baby comes alive. There's another dream in which a doctor is approached by a patient a big, fat, huge woman who leaps on her and pins her to the ground. And Giegerich talks about that dream in terms of the dreamer or the dream ego being absolutely pinned down by the weight of this other presence, this, well, what he would call the dreamer's other, which in this case is this massive body that is pinning this person down. And the other one is of the same doctor actually being overwhelmed, comes into her work and there's just full of patients and she can't cope. And he talks about the feeling of being overwhelmed as really reinforcing the ego, because what gets kind of reinforced and emphasized in that dream is the feeling of being overwhelmed. And that is a kind of, Giegerich, a kind of egoic feeling. So the dream is kind of highlighting the way the ego is being almost celebrated in a sense, in an adverse way, but it's being emphasized. So that might be in terms of trying to work with that person about understanding how they're caught and trapped in their egoic self, and trying to help them to understand that what is overwhelming them is something other within them, or rather the soul itself. They're overwhelmed, and when they feel overwhelmed and don't know what to do, they're stuck in their ego. And that would be, I mean, again, if, you know, as for Hillman and Jung, you know, the ego is very, well, certainly for Giegerich, the ego is very much the way modern man has kind of encapsulated himself psychically in a particular mode of being in the world. And for example, he talks about the way, you know, you might have a dream of yourself in a dream, a dream ego in the dream, but the dream ego is behaving completely differently to the way you normally behave. And then that the value of that might be, and again, this is taking it back on a personal level, the value might be to show that the ego, there are many different ways of being. One doesn't have to trap oneself in one's own identity. You know, we habituate to ourselves. We habituate ourselves to a certain identity. And sometimes a dream can show us in a completely different way of being, which may help on a personal level, us to kind of start seeing ourselves differently, that there may be other, you know, differences there. These are all, of course, very personal instances of using a dream. I mean, they're not, well, the idea of the ego, I mean, I don't know whether Giegerich would talk to a patient about that in that way, but, he's written a whole book about the ego, and how it's connected with modernity and the whole way of being and experiencing the world and ourselves is kind of encapsulated in that way of being, and how that traps us in a certain way.
Perfeito. Obrigado,
Yeah.
Michael. Michael, última pergunta, quem vai fazer é o André Dantas. O André foi o tradutor do Vida Lógica da Alma para o português. Então, é um prazer te apresentá-lo também. André, meu amigo, contigo.
Foi ótimo, né? Sem muitas dúvidas que eu tinha, né? Eu gostei muito da sua palestra, muitas dúvidas que eu tinha em relação ao livro. Se dissiparam, se diluíram, né? Mas eu fiquei com uma, né? E a respeito, uma dúvida a respeito do chamado sonhos lúcidos, né? Sonhos onde você está dentro de um sonho e você sabe que está sonhando, de alguma maneira você como que interage ativamente com o sonho, controla certas partes do sonho. É um tipo de sonho que costuma fascinar muito, né, as pessoas quando têm esse estilo de sonho. Mas eu fiquei pensando que dessa perspectiva do Giegerich, na verdade é um sonho bastante egóico, né? Porque você está ali como ego controlando o sonho. Né? E se, na verdade, o que costuma ser fascinante, na verdade é um sentimento bastante egóico, bastante subjetivo e bastante... não é nada demais. Né? Se você concorda com isso, como é que você pensa essa questão dos sonhos lúcidos, né?
Yeah, I mean, that would be my perspective on lucid dreaming, that it's the ego, as it were, taking control within the pushing the soul out in a sense, and kind of, turning the dream into something the ego, its own, fulfilling its own wishes, I guess, that it's wishful thinking, really, but having a knack to be able to do that and talk about that as far as I can remember in the book. But my sense of it would be exactly that it would be egoic, and I guess why does one want to do that? Why? What is it about letting the dream have its own autonomy that you want to change? But it's an interesting question, and wondering about how that actually happens. And I mean, I don't know. It's a curious sort of phenomena, really. But it is a big thing for a lot of people, but I personally don't think it's not in the framework of Giegerich or Hillman or Jung, that kind of psychology. Why is one doing? I mean, we're spending enough time already in our egos, so can we at least give them up for a few hours every night? Let somebody else. Well, it's Jung's thing. Let the dream have its say. Shut up, listen, be silent. Yeah.
Obrigado, André.
Michael,
queria terminar fazendo a pergunta final, é uma pergunta mais para saber a tua opinião. Qual o futuro da psicologia como disciplina da interioridade? Eu te pergunto isso em relação ao grupo, Greg Mogelson, Jennifer Sandoval, esteve aqui com a gente no Teatros. A Sociedade da Psicologia como disciplina da interioridade, virou um braço do campo junguiano, ou ela é alguma coisa própria, particular? Qual é a tua participação dentro do grupo? Qual você acha que vai ser o futuro dela? Como é que ela se articula com o pensamento junguiano? Quais são tuas impressões?
Well, I think that first of all, it does relate to certain aspects of Jungian thought or of Jung, but it's also a critical psychology. I mean, in the way that Jung's psychological types was meant to be a critical psychology. And I think its relationship with Jung is of finding its foundations in Jung, but equally reflecting back in a critical way on Jung, on those aspects that, from the perspective of, this psychology of interiority, would see as positivistic, as somehow not really grasping the idea of soul as we in that discipline of interiority understand it. So it's critical in that way. But Jung certainly, though he didn't explicitly bring it out, he did more so in the alchemical books, the collected works where he's studying the alchemical stuff. It begins to come out there, and he clearly, I mean, he had a deep antipathy to Hegel, so that probably stopped him seeing that a lot of his own thinking, had some connections with Hegel. And he did call Hegel a great psychologist, actually. I mean, he used those words. I think it has a kind of ambivalent relationship with the rest of the Jungian world. There, amongst some of the people in my country, in my group, there's a deep antipathy to, as there was to Hillman, there is to Giegerich, because it's seen as critical of Jung, which I think is a misunderstanding, because I don't think it's critical of certain aspects of Jung, of Jung's thinking, but I think Giegerich's criticism of Jung is that Jung had profound insight, but then he backed off from it. He withdrew. Heidegger criticized Kant, Immanuel Kant, because he thought Kant had actually had a profound insight, but then he drew back from it because he didn't have the intellectual courage or the ability to actually go through with it. I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'm just giving that as an example. So I think its relationship with the rest of the Jung world is very ambivalent. But my sense of, I mean, I've been in the group since the beginning. I mean, I don't really participate in it more than the conferences, though I write and I publish, and I try and write within the frame and tradition of the psychology of interiority now. That's the only way I'm interested in writing. So that's my contribution. But I think there is a developing interest. I mean, people, maybe not in England so much, the people in America, other places, when we have our conferences, there seems to be quite a connection around the world of interest in it. But it's difficult. It's a difficult way of thinking and working. And you have to spend a lot of time immersed in the books and immersed in trying to, grasp these things for oneself. And it takes, I mean, some people have a knack to be able to do it. I mean, Greg, I think, certainly, he was working with Hillman for Giegerich for many years into editing his books. So, he immersed himself, and he has that ability to think in that way, in a very fluid and also in a very personally original way. I find myself sometimes having to over-rely on Giegerich, although I'm getting better at kind of thinking things through and being able to use my own language and own kind of way of thinking. But a lot of people, you know, who train in the Jungian tradition don't want to give it up, you know, and some of Giegerich's, some of the work, some of the thinking in this tradition is critical, and it's not easy, and it takes a lot of time, and but I think my sense of it is that people in this group will think and write, and that if it has any future, it'll attract attention, and people will come and start reading, and may start thinking in a more reflective way about it, rather than, you know, feeling antagonistic toward it. That's my sense. I mean, I feel the same thing happened with Hillman. I mean, Hillman was sort of persona non grata in England. I mean, you know, he was intensely, a lot of antagonism toward Hillman. But over the years, people started reading and listening and beginning to understand. And then gradually, you know, it became a more acceptable figure. Whether that will happen with Giegerich, I don't know. I think Giegerich is more difficult to understand. Well, not Giegerich, but that way of thinking is more difficult. I think that's why the Japanese are so interested in his work, because in Kyoto University is the intellectual center of Zen and Zen philosophy, and there are similarities between Buddhist thought and the whole way of thinking in negation. I mean, you know, that's what happens in Zen. It's a process of negating, and this, you know, dialectic. And the Japanese seem to grasp that, I think, part of the kind of natural native thinking. So there's always been a strong tradition there. And, you know, the Japanese come over, or have been going over to Germany once a year and doing seminars with Giegerich on dreams. So maybe that's where the kind of future is. You know, they've written some interesting papers, the Japanese people, and they seem to be able to integrate it into their clinical work.
Uma informação valiosa para compartilhar com você, Michael, é que nós tivemos o lançamento do livro Da Vida Lógica da Alma aqui no Brasil. Isso tem cerca de um mês, e a primeira edição esgotou, surpreendentemente. Não sabemos muito bem o que aconteceu, mas ela esgotou. E nós ainda estamos engatinhando ou ensaiando uma intimidade com o pensamento do Giegerich, né? A gente tem o trabalho da Sônia Carvalho, que está aqui, do próprio André Dan.
Acho que caiu a internet dele, né?
Do grupo de Curitiba, que nos faz pensar que temos aí um futuro promissor. Quem sabe? Mas, Michael, queria te agradecer. Queria te agradecer pela tua gentileza.
Well, that sounds very promising. And very impressive. Impressive. I don't think Giegerich's book would sell in England out like that in 1 month. There isn't the intellectual depth. Sorry, but in England, Anglo-Saxon thinking is very empirical, very pragmatic, but the word intellect in England is a bit of an insult. If you say somebody is intellectual, it's usually said pejoratively. On the continent, it would be a way of valuing somebody, and but in England, it's people don't, you know, they're very suspicious about people who are intellectuals. Anyway, sorry, I'm running my own country down. But there we go.
Yeah. Eu queria te agradecer pela tua gentileza, por você se disponibilizar em trazer um livro tão denso, né? Sempre lembrando um livro tão denso para a gente, e de um modo que me pareceu muito acessível, muito pedagógico, muito didático. Queria agradecer efetivamente a sua colaboração. Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you very much for your invite, and I appreciate it. And it's a real privilege to speak with you and to try and answer some of the questions. So you'll have to forgive me if I haven't done them justice, but I'm still trying to understand it. So anyway, thank you.
Espero que nós possamos nos reencontrar em breve.
Go well, and I hope things. Yeah, and I hope things in Brazil start getting better.
Obrigado, Michael.
Yeah, okay.
Pessoal, obrigado pela presença.
See you.
Acho que tivemos um encontro muito bom, muito didático, né, André? Também achei bem pedagógico, eu diria. E ficamos aqui, então, com um convite para o dia 12 agora de novembro, né, Luciana?
Sim.
Analista francesa Brigitte Alain Dupré. Você tem o tema, Lu?
Quando o analista diz eu, examinando a PMA, procriação medicamente assistida com Jung e Bill.
Fica o convite.
When the analyst says, okay, thank you. I'm not sure what I'm doing on the 12th, but thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Seja bem-vindo.
Okay.
Um grande abraço a todos.
Thank you. Go well.